Okay, to continue on here, let's now talk about population growth. All right, in your notes you have a little bit there that you should look over because you're going to be able to need to calculate population growth. All right, so look in your notes. I think there's an example about mice. Be able to calculate population growth. We'll go through that in class. I'm going to go over a couple of the more general concepts here. If a species is allowed to reach its full biotic potential, and what that means is its ability to reproduce at its maximum rate. So there's no limiting factors, there's no limiting resources. If a species is allowed to reproduce at its maximum rate, that's what's called biotic potential. If that's true, if that happens, you end up with a population time graph called a J-curve. This is the famous J-curve. And a J-curve is species is born, and if it's able to reproduce at its maximum rate, there's no death. All the babies survive, and all those go on to have more babies, and you end up with this time graph called a J-curve. All right, now this, you can't have a population of infinity, so this type of growth is non-sustainable. The J-curve. Pretty simple concept. Let's take a look at an example here. You have the biotic potential of a common housefly for 1 year. So if we look here, a female lays 120 eggs per generation. Half of those eggs are going to develop into females, and then there's 7 generations per year. So what we're looking at down here is the generations of 1 year. And if you look here in the first generation, a common housefly will lay 120 eggs. If it's allowed to reproduce at maximum rate and there's all survivors, there's no limiting resources, in 1 year you'll end up with an astronomical amount of houseflies. So that's a nice example, the common housefly, to look at the biotic potential of that species. Luckily, we don't have this. Luckily, there are limiting resources, predators, disease. Luckily we aren't overrun with the common housefly. So what happens in the real world here with population growth? You can have a characteristic J-curve. You can have these explosions of population where they reach their biotic potential. You can have that. More commonly, there's some type of environmental resistance, some type of limiting factors. So you'll have exponential growth, growth that doubles over time, but at some point you're going to have this leveling off of a population. And it's going to happen, that leveling off is going to happen when you reach something called the carrying capacity, and that's represented by this line here. The carrying capacity is the amount of a species that can be sustained in an ecosystem. Okay, the carrying capacity. So what's going to keep that number down? What's going to keep this J-curve and make it into more of what we're going to call an S-curve? Environmental resistance. That's represented here in this graph. That could be predators, disease, lack of food, any type of environmental resistance that's going to slow the population and keep it at or near the carrying capacity. So that's called the S-curve. And that's more or less what happens in nature. But it's not so smooth. It's not as smooth as you would think. The S-curve is great. It's a nice example in theory. But what we usually have are population oscillations. All right, usually you'll have a characteristic J-curve. A population will explode, and it'll actually go across the carrying capacity. That population go above the carrying capacity. So let's think of houseflies. Let's stay with that example. You'll have a population explosion, and you'll actually overshoot, what's called an overshoot. You'll overshoot the carrying capacity. And the ecosystem cannot support that many. So what you're going to have is called a dieback. And when that dieback happens, so many of the population will die back that it'll actually go below the carrying capacity. So you'll have population growth again, and you'll overshoot the carrying capacity, and the population will level off, and you'll have another dieback. So you won't really get the characteristic S-curve, but over time, you'll end up with a stable population. It takes time to meet that equilibrium. So what causes these diebacks are your limiting resources. In this case, we're going to call them density-dependent variables. they depend on the density of a population. And when that density gets too high, too much for the carrying capacity of the environment, those density-dependent variables will cause a dieback. Things like starvation, disease. Those are the things that will force a decrease in population. There are some species that don't follow that rule. They follow more or less what's called an eruptive cycle. Okay, and raccoons are an example of a species that follows this eruptive cycle. So you have periods where there's population skyrockets, right? In 1867, 1899. You can even look here at 1875 and 1897. For some reason, the population exploded, and it went way beyond the carrying capacity, and then you had a huge dieback. But it wasn't in such a cyclic manner. It was more or less in an eruptive, what we call an eruptive cycle. And those occur for a number of reasons. Usually it occurs because of changes in the environment. All right, it happens to the species who have high biotic potential. So you might see an eruptive cycle within a species, and we'll be looking at examples of these in class. Okay, so here are the density-dependent factors. For those of you who like definitions, these are the things that will bring a species back down after overshooting carrying capacity and then keep that species population close to the carrying capacity. Things like predators, disease, intraspecific competition. All right, and we might have talked about that already. Intraspecific competition is competition within a species. And then there's also interspecific competition, competition between different species. So those are two very important terms, but they're also examples of density-dependent factors, things that bring a population down because of the population density. I know this is a little blurry, but I really like this table here. These are factors that cause changes in population. So if you notice here, some of those factors that cause changes in populations are our density-dependent factors. So food shortages, competition, disease, all right, introduction of an exotic species, predators, all right, and then your competition. Those are the density-dependent factors. But then there's also density-independent factors. All right, they're independent of the population of a species. So it could be, these are things that could happen to a small population. They could happen to a large population, like the density-dependent factors. So if you think about it, a flood, a fire, all right, humans come in and spray pesticides, all right, change in climate. It doesn't matter the population of a species. These things are going to impact the population. Destruction of habitat, drought. So it should make sense to you that any type of natural disaster, for example, it doesn't matter what the population is, it will affect that. So you have density-independent factors, and then you have your density-dependent factors. Now, all those examples, what we've been talking about so far, have been more or less interspecific across different species. Those are concepts that apply across species. The next topic about population are survivorship curves. These are more or less intraspecific. We're going to look at species themselves. And the best way to look at this, it's a nice graph here, the survivorship curves. The survivorship curves are the ability of something to survive through its lifespan. I'll write that down. The ability of a species to survive throughout its lifespan. Pretty much talking about an entire population, not just one individual species, but the ability of a population of species to survive throughout its lifespan. So if you look at the graph here, the y-axis is actually, let's talk about that as population at birth. So all these species have a high population at birth. There's a lot of them being born. All right, but there's one type of species that when they're born, most of them survive for the entire lifespan. And then at the end, there's some sort of huge drop-off. All right, so in this survivorship curve, most will survive at birth, and they'll survive throughout their lifespans. There's good quality life, and then some point later in life, they'll all basically die. And an example is humans. If you think about humans, most of us live at birth and survive, and then we live a long life, and then in elderly years, we all pass away. Okay, so then you have a type of species that at birth, some will die throughout their life, and as life goes on, some will die, and they basically fall off at the end in late stage. So you have this steady rate of decrease throughout their lives. And then there's a type of species that as soon as they're born, most of them die. And then those that live, those that survive that initial die-off, will live a long life and survive throughout their lifespan, and then at some point they decrease. Alright, so you have basically 3 types of survivorship curve, and we're going to label them, very sophisticated. Type 1, Type 2, and you can guess the third one is Type 3. Okay, so Type 1 species is this first one, where most survive and they live a long life, and then you have this huge die-off. Alright, and humans are an example of that. And then the Type 2 is the steady rate of decrease throughout their life, and Type 3 is an example of a species where there's a lot born, but most of them die, and then those that survive will live their lifespan, and you have a die-off at the end. An example of the third one, of a Type 3 species, would be most plants, maybe mice. Throw mice in there, you have a huge litter, but only a few actually live. Those are 2 good examples of a Type 3. And if you remember Darwin, our discussion about Darwin, he talked about it's those traits that allow a species to survive. So it's those traits in this species, in a Type 3 species, that allow them to survive. If you throw in Darwin's discussion there, it kind of explains why after a huge die-off, some of those species are going to survive. And he also questioned, why do species have a huge amount of offspring? Why does one mating pair produce a huge amount of offspring? And this is the reason, this Type 3. Because there's a huge die-off to ensure survival. They have to have a lot of offspring because most of them are going to die. So these 3 basic types of survivor curves explain different characteristics of different species. And you can even see, if you remember the movie The Cane Toad, I'm sure you all remember the cane toad. Alright, in Hawaii, the cane toad had a lot of babies, had a lot of offspring, because there was predators and there was those limiting factors, and that most of them were going to die off. So in order to ensure survival, the cane toad had to have a lot of offspring so that some survived. So in Hawaii, the cane toad was a Type 3 species. But when they took that cane toad and introduced it into an environment where there was few limiting factors, when they took it to Australia, it actually changed to a Type 1. There was few limiting factors, few predators, nothing to keep the population down. So a lot were born and a lot of them live all throughout for their entire lifespan. And then you have a huge die-off. So in Australia, the cane toad became a Type 1 species. So you can see how a species can change depending on the introduction into a new ecosystem where there's few limiting factors. Interesting stuff. Moving right along, we have a table here, and you can pause this and take a look at this yourself. I'm just going to go through it real quick. These are strategies of species and their population growth. So these are strategies by a species for population growth. And there's basically 2 strategies. There's one called externally controlled growth, and then there's intrinsically controlled growth. So if you're a Malthuist, you believe that species have externally controlled growth. All right, these are the species like insects, rodents, a lot of plants. They have externally controlled growth. So what that means is they're regulated by extrinsic factors. So those abiotic factors, predation, the limiting factors that we're talking about here. Their growth is externally controlled. All right, and then these species are going to be the ones that live short lives, experience rapid growth. They mature early. All right, they produce a lot of offspring, so they have high biotic potential. All right, little investment in individual offspring. All right, so little parental care. They're adapted to unstable environments. They tend to have high stress levels. Okay, so these are your species that have externally controlled growth. Then there's other species that are more intrinsically controlled. Okay, these are our longer living species: wolves, elephants, whales, primates. All right, they grow slowly, they mature late, they have fewer offspring. So this is basically the opposite of the externally controlled species. All right, these are our specialists, our predators. They live in more stable environments, high parental care. So take a look at this. It's just a nice chart that shows the difference between two different species, ones that are externally controlled and ones that are intrinsically controlled. All right, you should take a look at that and understand the difference between those. And it should make sense to you. Okay, and that brings us to two types of species: the R strategists and the K strategists. So chugging right along here, we're going to talk about R strategists, and the R strategists are what we call generalists. These species are found in many locations around the world. They're opportunistic. They'll come in and take over. They're basically found all over the world. They can survive anywhere. And these species are typically small in size. All right, they have high biotic potential. We talked a lot about this in the last slide. Okay, they have few limiting factors. Again, they can live anywhere. Okay, they're usually your prey. This is you're usually your prey. They have short lives. So these generalists are important to understand because these are the ones we're going to want to control their populations. We're not real worried about these becoming endangered because they're so opportunistic. They're found in so many locations. They can live anywhere. And based on these characteristics, they can survive tremendous amounts of stress, usually. So, example would be the mouse. Classic example. Mice are found all over the world. Most of the Pennsylvania wildlife are generalists. All right, most of the wildlife that we have here in Pennsylvania are generalists. So think about that as we move to a different type of species, the K strategists. All right, this is actually the complete opposite. The K strategists are what we call specialists. Opposite from the R strategists, usually have longer lives, have low biotic potential. They typically care for their young because they have low biotic potential. They are very specific locations. A lot of these are what we call the endemic species. All right, and then most importantly, I guess, would be they have very specific food requirements, which goes along with specific locations. These are the ones, the K strategists, the specialists. These are the ones that we do have to worry about. All right, their populations can be harmed very easily. An example here is our primate, but also think about a whale. A whale is a K strategist. It's a specialist. It has low biotic potential. They live long lives. They have very specific food requirements. But if you think about a whale, they have 2 young every 10 years. So by killing 2 whales, you're killing a whole whale generation. Where if you kill 2 mice, a generalist, it has very little impact on their population. So, that's a nice example to think about the difference between a K strategist and an R strategist. So make sure you understand the difference between R strategists and K strategists, because we're going to be looking at a lot of examples of these, and this is a very nice concept to understand wildlife and wildlife populations and wildlife conservation. And that brings us to the minimum viable population, this concept that pretty much describes the lowest number of population you can have and still maintain a sustainable population. All right, so this is when you have a population that needs to recover. All right, what's the minimum you need to restore? What's the minimum you need in nature to rebuild that population, to restore that population? And if you go below, there's too many stresses. You won't be able to sustain that population. So if there's any type of bottleneck or change in the environment, there won't be enough of them to adapt, to survive. So what's the minimum viable population? And this graph does a good job of displaying this concept. And so let's go through this real quick. And we're going to be concerned with the large carnivores and the small herbivores. All right, so what you have here is predator and prey. Along the x-axis we have a park area, and along the y-axis you have your number of individuals in a population. How many do you need? The minimum population. All right, the minimum viable population. Take a look at the park area. As you have less area, you need less population, all right, because there's less area. So think about your limiting resources. All right, but as there's more area, you can sustain more population. That's where everything is. All right, as you have larger areas. So that should make sense. But let's go through this together here. All right, so park area. What's the lowest number of population you can have and still sustain itself? So think about predator and prey. And if you take an area of, let's say, 10,000 hectares, all right, and you draw your line up here, at that amount of space, you don't really need too many carnivores, all right, and that should make sense because they're higher up on the food chain. All right, so think about the ecological efficiency pyramid. The minimum population is actually lower with carnivores, but you need a lot of herbivores, primary consumers, to sustain the population of fewer carnivores. So this is a concept that I want you to understand, and it really ties things together. Just kind of knowing if a population falls below the minimum viable population, there's too many pressures and you won't have survival. So if that doesn't make sense, there's a nice explanation in your notes, but you can come back and replay this and take a look at this a little bit further if you need to. Wow, that was a lot of information. You might be confused. Maybe you're starting to imagine things that aren't true. But I think now it's time to get up and go get something to eat. Maybe you're a little tired after all that information, but hopefully you feel much smarter about populations and wildlife habits and ecosystems and biodiversity as a whole, and hopefully you feel more prepared to talk about these concepts not only in class but out there in the world. I want to thank you for listening to these series of lectures on biodiversity, and I'll see you in the classroom.